Welcome to this video podcast. I'm going to be talking about psychiatry ARCPs as they're happening in the summer of 2020. And I'm hoping this will be of use to trainees as they're coming up to their ARCP, and supervisors helping support trainees in their preparations, and panel members on the day thinking through the various decisions that arise and how these are perhaps rather different at the moment. So this is going to be based very much on the recently published Royal College of Psychiatrists ARCP Decision Aid that you may have seen on the college website. Just one slight word of warning in that at the time of preparing this podcast, which is the 30th of April, this decision aid does need final confirmation by the GMC. So hopefully not too many changes, but just be aware of that. So my name is Kristy Rothman. I am the head of school in the east of England. My work is based in Cambridge, and with the deanery I help with their professional support and wellbeing service. I lead ARCP panel chair training across specialties in the east of England, and I've been working with the Royal College on various aspects of ARCPs really since the Psychiatric Trainees Committee produced their supported and valued report in 2017 to help bring about some of those recommendations. What I'm going to be talking about is a summary of the changes to ARCPs because of the current COVID situation, a brief overview of guidance from the Conference of Postgraduate Medical Deans across the UK, and then following the guide from the Royal College, changes in evidence that's required for psychiatry ARCPs, and a guide for panel decision making. So this is really designed to help trainees prepare for their ARCPs in the current circumstance and for supervisors to know what's expected. And as we go through, we'll talk a bit about how the current situation draws on usual practice and how it differs from it. So the current situation perhaps doesn't need that much introduction, but we are going through extraordinary and extremely difficult times at the moment. And it's worth saying that psychiatry trainees are very much in the front line, working in acute hospitals, in the community, seeing people at home and on our wards, and are facing this with considerable courage and leadership while dealing with their own anxieties about their families and their own health. And of course, this situation has had a significant impact on training, both in terms of clinical experience people are getting and opportunities for training that arise. So as you know, ARCPs are a fairly formal process to review evidence presented, to make judgments about how trainees are progressing through training, the competencies they're acquiring, the stage of training they're at, and whether they're ready to move on to the next stage of training, ultimately towards completion of training. And it has a role in supporting revalidation of trainees with the GMC. So there's quite a strong element of patient safety running through ARCPs, ensuring that doctors have the right skills for the stage of training they're at. And the key document for ARCP processes is the Gold Guide, with the most recent edition published at the end of March this year. So there's the web address if you want to have a look. That goes into a lot of detail about how ARCPs run and what's expected. So we have some guidance from the four-nation education bodies. The purpose of ARCPs at this time remains essentially the same as usual. But there is recognition that it's not likely to be possible to prepare the usual evidence for ARCPs, and because of that the Educational Supervisor Report is the key document that will help panels decide how a trainee is doing. And likewise, panels consider what they call compensatory evidence for where some types of evidence, and we'll talk about this in a moment, may not be that available. Normally panels consist of 3 members, so it may be the case that panels consist of 2 members at this time. But the usual outcomes and rules of the Gold Guide still apply in general, except a few specific circumstances, one of which is a new outcome, outcome 10, which is specific for this situation. And we'll talk about that in a bit of detail. So from a psychiatry perspective, we're anticipating that most ARCP panels will still take place. Now, if that isn't possible because of difficulties getting hold of panelists, then ARCPs will focus at key transition points, so end of ST3, end of higher training, and trainees who've had previous adverse outcomes, but we would hope that trainees got a suitable amount of notice about this, because obviously quite a lot of work goes into preparing for ARCPs. Now, running through the guide is divided into a section on appropriate evidence. So that's perhaps most helpful for trainees thinking of preparing for their ARCP and getting support from their supervisors, and then how the panel reviews that evidence. So we'll go through that. As you know, normally trainees would come to their ARCPs with a range of evidence to support their progression through training. This will include a range of work-based placed assessments, some other activities and supporting documents. That might include some reflective notes, might include courses attended, other types of uploaded documents. They'll have reports from their psychiatric supervisors they've been working with and reports from their educational supervisor. And trainees would submit a Form R to help with the revalidation aspects of their ARCP, or if the trainee's in Scotland, an SOAR declaration. And to some extent this will all still be the case, but we'll discuss to what extent in a moment. Don't forget that evidence should be submitted 2 weeks before an ARCP, because the panel does start looking at the portfolio and the supervisor reports in advance of the day. So try not to get caught out by that, though I appreciate that we're obviously running to fairly tight timetables at the moment. So supervisors' reports, as we mentioned, are going to be key documents for the ARCP panel, and we really want educational supervisors to comment on any impact that the COVID-19 has had on training, so opportunities to do work-based placed assessments, teaching programs, and so on. But we really want supervisors to describe the trainees' capabilities and how they've been doing. And if the supervisor isn't available, which might happen if they're unwell or if they've been redeployed themselves, then just to note that an alternative medical educator can complete these reports if needed. So there's a bit of room there if you're struggling to get hold of your supervisor. So obviously a large component of trainees' portfolios usually will be their work-based placed assessments. And there is general recognition that opportunities to complete work-based placed assessments may be significantly reduced since March 2020. For example, if trainees are working from home, if they've been redeployed due to supervisor availability and a range of other circumstances. And this will affect different types of work-based placed assessments differently. So case conferences, for example, and journal clubs may well have been cancelled, whereas clinical work where it's possible to get a case-based discussion may well have continued. There's a work-based placed assessment that higher trainees use called a DONCS, a direct observation of non-clinical skills, that is potentially more important. So for example, where trainees are liaising with teams, offering advice, working remotely, and so on. So that's still of use for higher trainees, and now actually of use potentially for core trainees as well. So they wouldn't normally do DONCS, but is another way of showing evidence. And the general requirements for work-based placed assessments are being reduced by a third across the portfolio, across the curriculum in core and higher training. So just to look at that in a bit of detail, in core training, for example, the previous work-based placed assessment requirements would have had a minimum of 16, and that's been reduced to 11. And likewise, in child and adolescent higher training, trainees would have submitted 16, been reduced to 11, or forensic higher training has gone from 14 to 10. They're not exact reductions of a third, but approximate. And this is recognition that it is much harder to get work-based placed assessments done really since March, but the trainees clearly should have been doing them before March for the previous part of the year in any case. So the overall work-based placed assessments have been reduced. Now what the guide doesn't do is state the specific types of work-based placed assessments, and to some extent that's difficult because we like clarity and it's good to know what's expected, but at the same time we don't want to make it difficult for trainees who have different opportunities to get evidence in their portfolio. And if we stipulated too closely the exact types of work-based placed assessment, then that could cause problems. But we do ask panels to consider work-based placed assessments very flexibly in terms of what they demonstrate of their competencies rather than the specific numbers. So for example, if a trainee was expected to do a journal club presentation, then a case-based discussion where the trainee discusses a clinical case and maybe brings some evidence from the scientific literature and discusses that with their supervisor would be considered appropriate evidence working towards that curriculum objective without the specific work-based placed assessments. Or perhaps in higher training, a higher trainee was on a leadership course or doing a leadership program, and that's not happening anymore, but uses some reflexive pieces in their portfolio to consider leadership skills in the current situation. For example, again, that would be entirely suitable evidence to support curriculum progression in that area. But we want there to be flexibility in what trainees produce in their portfolio. There is a specific mention of the mini-PAT, the 360-degree feedback tool, in the guide, because that clearly might be effective if trainees have been redeployed over the last few weeks, or if they're working remotely and have less contact with the team. So I don't think panels are going to expect mini-PATs from the last few months. So hopefully that's a bit reassuring. I would encourage trainees still to submit quite a range of types of work-based placed assessment. I think that strengthens the portfolio quite a lot and would make it easier for the panel. I think if trainees solely presented single types of work-based placed assessments, that would be really quite difficult to comment on the broader aspects of the curriculum. But I think, as I say, within that there's quite a range of flexibility of the evidence to be submitted. And the supervisor's report is going to be key. There are some specific bits of evidence that are going to be important. In core training, psychotherapy competencies would be one of those. There's updated guidance you may have seen on the college website about this, and is mainly going to affect CT3 trainees, and particularly trainees who had been doing a psychotherapy case but had that disrupted by the COVID-19 situation. Now, it may still be the case for the psychotherapy tutor to sign off the competencies. So that's always been the case. So if a trainee was doing a long case and say the patient dropped out of psychotherapy near the end, then the psychotherapy tutor may have been able to sign off the competencies of the trainee and the trainee progress as normal. That's still the case, but any incomplete psychotherapy competencies should be documented by the educational supervisor, and we'll talk about how that may be considered in the second section, looking at the panel outcomes. So that's core training. Looking at higher training, there's a specific situation that might arise, usually for ST6 higher trainees who are in a subspecialty endorsement post. So this would be liaison psychiatry or substance misuse or rehabilitation psychiatry, where the COVID-19 has led to a trainee missing part of the 12 months. And that's important because that's been a key aspect of the subspecialty endorsement, that people have a full 12 months experience in that. Now, there are two situations a trainee might find themselves in. The first is where they've been redeployed away from that, but can show that their competencies have been met through their work-based placed assessments. So those have also been reduced in number, of course, and their supervisor reports. In which case, if they can show evidence that they were redeployed, so that would probably be a letter from their medical director and confirmation from their training program director, that then their case will be taken to the college and reviewed on an individual basis before leading to a recommendation to the GMC for subspecialty endorsements. That should still be possible even without a full 12 months, but does require a bit of extra evidence. Where the competencies aren't present, then that's a slightly different situation, and trainees should, panels should ensure trainees are offered time to complete the competencies after the post would normally have finished. So the trainees can still get subspecialty endorsement, but it may involve time after they would normally have finished. Now, it may be the case that trainees want to present evidence on how their training has been affected by COVID-19 in their portfolio. Now, actually, it's possible in England that HEE may require this along with the Form R, actually. So there may be a mandated form for trainees that hasn't appeared yet, on how their training has been affected. But if not, a trainee may wish to upload a report anyway to help the panel understand how training has been affected by the current situation. And there are 2 examples contained in the appendix to the Royal College of Psychiatry guide to consider. So the first from John Russell, our curriculum developer, looks at the competency-based impact of changes to training. So this essentially is looking at what we're aiming for, the competencies in the from the curriculum, and how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed that, either in an enhanced way or in a negative way, and things that can be developed. So that will run through the different ILOs. So the example report runs to several pages, so this is just the first bit of it, according to various domains. But that looks at competencies, that's kind of outcome based. Another way of looking at this, and this is the part of the other report contained in the guide, is to look at opportunity-based impact. So this comes originally, I think, from the Northwest Deanery, so Dr. Margaret Campbell, and this looks at how training has been affected, so not at competency outcomes, but things like teaching sessions, exams, changes in clinical placement, and so on. And there would be ways for trainees to give the panel a bit of information about how their training has been affected. But I think they're perhaps rather less important than having that supervisor's report and work-based place assessments as you can, but in a way that can be considered flexibly towards different competencies. So that's looking at the evidence. Now I want to move on to how the panel is going to consider that. And some general considerations to start with. So just to note, we're still using the e-portfolio, of course, and the outcome forms, though I think the educational supervisor form and the ARCP outcome form may be slightly different to take account of the situation. As mentioned, the normal range of outcomes still applies, and actually what we'd expect is that most trainees would get an outcome 1, so that's progressing satisfactorily through training, or an outcome 6 if they've completed training as usual. So that really shouldn't be different, and we'd hope that trainees will be able to do that even with reduced evidence. We do want panels to be particularly mindful of any disruption to training if giving an adverse outcome. So an outcome 2, a 3 or a 4, panels really need to be clear that this hasn't been affected by COVID-19, which could have happened in a number of ways. So trainees may have had limited experience because of COVID-19, they may have had reduced ability to demonstrate competencies. So quite a number of things may have happened that affects training that panels need to consider if they're thinking of an adverse outcome. And partly because of that, then, there's a new outcome, an outcome 10, that's been produced for this situation. And this is an outcome, not an adverse outcome, but an outcome that recognises training affected by COVID. And there are 2 types. There's a outcome 10.1, so this allows progression through training. So that would be either at a non-critical progression point, so CT2 to CT3, or where it is a critical progression point, say at the end of CT3, but because of changes to the curriculum, a trainee can now progress. So that might happen with psychotherapy, which we'll talk about. So that's 10.1. 10.2 is where progression is impossible. And this is mainly in psychiatry, going to be trainees at the end of higher training who are due to get their CCT, but can't because they haven't got some particular aspect of the curriculum completed. So it's not an adverse outcome, as I said, and should be used with C codes. So C codes are a bit like N codes and U codes, which are used in ARCPs already, which just provide a bit of definition to these outcomes. And there are a few that are more likely to apply to psychiatry trainees. So here we have a 10.1 C2. So trainees at a critical training progression point, so end of CT3, for example, but can progress due to change requirements. And this might apply to a trainee who's got outstanding psychotherapy competencies, haven't been able to complete it because of the coronavirus situation, and here the Royal College has made a change to the curriculum that allows them to progress to ST4, and then complete that aspect of their training in ST4. Or possibly a C4 where trainees have had prolonged isolations. This could be either a 10.1 or a 10.2 depending on where they are in training. Now actually what we'd hope is that many trainees who were isolating perhaps because of a health condition would have been able to continue with training despite that. So they might be able to work from home, do telephone consultations, video consultations, liaise with the team and so on. And if that's satisfactory, should still receive an outcome 1 and not be have outstanding competencies because of that. Another outcome is an outcome, again, either 10.1 or 10.2 C5, where possibly a trainee was struggling a bit before COVID-19, but satisfactory progression may well have been possible had there not been disruption. So due to attending training programs or being able to do work-based assessments that showed improvement. So on the whole, for outcome 10s, we're not expecting them to be that common in psychiatry. We're hoping that most trainees have continued with training, albeit in different circumstances, and will progress as normal. Any outcome 10s will require clear documentation about what's left to do, so that can be completed, and then needs to be reviewed at an appropriate time. So that may be fairly soon. So if you've got a trainee on a 10.2 who would have got a CCT, then that's going to need to be reviewing fairly soon, perhaps 3 months, to ensure they get their CCT and can move into a consultant post. If a trainee's got a longer thing to do, maybe a psychotherapy long case in ST4, that might be picked up at their next ARCP in a year's time. So the time for review will vary. But the key thing is we expect outcome 10s to be quite rare because we expect trainees to be getting outcome 1s and outcome 6. So there's a slightly complicated diagram that's contained in the guidance at the back. This comes from CopMed about use of 10.1s, 10.2s. So I won't go through that in detail, but just to note that it's there for use. As we mentioned, there are some specific requirements in core training that might lead to an outcome 10. For core trainees struggling with psychotherapy competencies, then I think the first question is, can their psychotherapy tutor sign them off and get them progressing as normal? If not, then that's possibly an outcome 10.1 C2, and a trainee would progress through to ST4, do their psychotherapy case in ST4 and get it signed off. And that would be the same for ECT requirements. If a trainee hasn't completed that at the end of CT3, though you'd hope that core trainees would have done their ECT requirements before that stage of training. So I think that is also going to be quite unusual. A slightly different situation in higher trainees approaching CCT. They might get a 10.2 if they're not able to get competencies because of COVID-19. I guess might get an outcome 3 for extension time, or 4 if it's clearly not related to COVID-19. They're possibly a bit hard to see how that might be the case, but options there. I know trainees will be concerned about the exam requirements, and passing the RCPsych exams does remain part of core training. That's considered an important part of core training that isn't being changed. As you know, paper A and B sittings have been cancelled in this 6-month period. There haven't been cancellations of the CASC exam except one of the sittings abroad, I think. So this shouldn't affect UK trainees. There have been some amendments because of those written paper cancellations that now allow exams to be sat in any order. So trainees can sit the CASC even if they haven't passed the written exams. So that's designed to help trainees progress later. So just to say, there are no plans at the moment to cancel the CASC in September, though it may run slightly differently with social distancing and so on. So in a sense, this is kind of business as usual for exams in that there hasn't been a sitting of the CASC exam, which up until now has been the end requirement of exams, since January, and the next one is September. So if a trainee is on extension time, they wouldn't have had a sitting of the CASC exam anyway. That hasn't been actually affected by COVID. So should receive an outcome 3 into extension time and possibly an outcome 4 if they've had extension time already. It'd be a bit hard to argue that that's been affected by the pandemic. So for exams, trainees wouldn't be able to progress on a 10.1. There may be trainees who've been unwell, and the usual rules apply here. So absences of more than 14 working days, other than annual leave or study leave, require a review of the CCT date by the ARCP panel. That's not to say it necessarily needs to change, and often it doesn't if the absence is around that time, not much longer than that. This is done separately from the outcome number, so doesn't need an adverse outcome of any form, doesn't particularly need an outcome 10. The CCT date is just changed to recognise the time away from training. There will be a number of trainees who returned into clinical training from academic time, for example, or other out-of-program experiences, and they will need to have their training time recognised. Speaking of academic trainees, they should continue to have joint clinical and academic panels. The academic work may have been affected in a number of different ways, really. So some will have returned to clinical work. A lot of academic activity has suffered quite a lot of disruption and research may have been halted. If a trainee has returned to clinical work, the training time should be recognised towards their CCT. Where a trainee wasn't in clinical training, but their academic time was disrupted, then they might need an outcome 10.1 in order to flag up that they need to make up the academic time, which they should get as soon as is suitable. And we want that recorded on the ARCP form. So I'd hope that ARCPs aren't actually just about outcome numbers or CCT dates. We really want them to be formative and supportive, and really actually a good experience for trainees where panels recognise the work that's been done and that often excellence has been achieved in really quite a wide variety of ways. So ARCPs should have value for the trainee as well as the wider system, and that should be reflected in the documentation. We certainly want the reasons for the outcome to be clear, and that any remaining competencies should also be very clearly documented on the ARCP outcome form so that trainees know exactly what's required of them for their coming training time. If there are adverse outcomes, 2, 3 or 4, or an outcome leading to ongoing competencies, I would suggest the trainees are offered support. So perhaps through their professional support and wellbeing service, should have a development plan produced with them, and adverse outcomes as usual would have a face-to-face meeting, but this would be on video call, usually. And future competencies may well require some thought given to the future training program. Now some of that may be fairly generic and could be achieved in a number of posts, but there are some specific things that may require a bit more thought. So if trainees doing psychotherapy in ST4, for our child and adolescent run through trainees, they may have missed their paediatric placement, so we'll need to catch that up. Trainees who haven't been able to achieve endorsement competencies may need more time in that post after this. And as I mentioned, academic time may need to be caught up. So there are a few things that require a little bit of planning, and the trainee should discuss with their educational supervisor and quite possibly training program director to ensure this happens. So we've looked there through the guide at the appropriate evidence the trainees might want to submit and the panel outcomes. I hope this was helpful. The guidance really is there to support trainees, trainers and panels in how they conduct their ARCPs. We want ARCPs to be fair and transparent and supportive, but also recognise that training has been affected over these last few weeks and will be slightly different because of that. While patient safety remains a fundamental principle for ARCPs, we want the panels to have flexibility in how they look at the evidence and really look for evidence of trainees' competencies and progression where at all possible, even in these difficult circumstances. The full guidance document can obviously be found on the Royal College of Psychiatry website. So I will stop there. If you have questions, you may be best speaking to your training program director or head of school, because they'll know about your local situation, but you're welcome to send questions my way. You can find my email address on the East of England website, and I'm often on Twitter, so feel free to send questions or comments to me either way. And I hope you found this video podcast helpful. I hope it explains some aspects of the Psychiatry ARCPs, how they're going to run over the next few months, and I wish you all the best for your training. And for supervisors, thank you very much for all you're doing for our trainees at this time.